I mean, imagine though, going through your whole life, like thinking that you hate a type of person when really you don't even understand what you hate.
They were ripping open their private letters to figure out what was going on. Like, why are you so obsessed?
They were told that they shouldn't be feeling that if they were feeling that, they were sick. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of Social Discord, Queer as History, Equality, and Empathy for LGBTQ People. I'm Dalen Turk, your host for today.
I'm Kara Tebow.
And I'm Curtis Medina.
So as I said, today's episode, Queer as History, Equality, and Empathy for LGBTQ plus people, is going to be the first of a 3-part series diving into the LGBTQ plus community. And to save myself time and something that we'll go over later, I'm going to go ahead and say the queer community. We will discuss later on why that is now accepted in today's environment. But to start off today's episode, we want to go over some of the questions that we're looking to answer for ourselves and that hopefully you can find answers for within today's episode. Starting off, why is Pride Month celebrated in June? It's something that's swallowed the nation every June, and it's become more and more popular. And so we want to discover really why is that. Another one is, why does the rainbow represent the queer community? It's become the symbolic thing that everyone notices and everyone recognizes immediately when they see those rainbow stripes. Another one, how have LGBTQ plus people been treated in various time periods, and how are they treated now? Throughout the episode, we're going to be going over different time periods, different laws, different incidents, different groups that were really brought on, and different things that happened throughout time in America and abroad that LGBTQ people have had to face and deal with. And lastly, what is a word that can include all the spectrum of the LGBTQ people? Before we head in, Curtis, our main architect for today's episode, when you were typing up the notes, when you're doing the research for this show, what did you have in mind going into it? What were the type of people that you really wanted to communicate this episode to?
Yeah, one of the important things of this episode is we want you to listen to it no matter who you are, and maybe even especially if you are a conservative or somebody who doesn't think you've ever met a gay person or, thinks it's kind of a fad that people are just doing right now, that, they're just kind of messing around with it because it's popular or anything like that. We want you to listen to it all the way to the end. We don't want you to tune out and only people be left are as I've been referring to it as the queer choir. Basically that's what you end up preaching to at a lot of these events and for a lot of these episodes are people who basically are already kind of, somewhat educated or somewhat sold on the idea of equality. So, if you disagree, we really want you to listen all the way through. And the other type of person that I really want to reach with this episode is somebody who's questioning their sexuality or is gay and doesn't exactly know what to do about it. We want you to listen because there's a lot of things that you probably don't know about the history of the queer movement. So going right into the topic, some primers just to kind of make life easier. The first thing is actually an answer to one of the questions we just posed was, what is an easier thing to say than LGTBQ or LGBTQ, all kinds of different ways you can put it. Generally, it's accepted right now to use the word queer, which actually used to be a slur thrown at gay people up until about the 80s. And then in the 90s, it started kind of being repurposed, taken back as a really kind of simple, direct word, which, basically means that you're something a little bit different than the normative. If you're curious, the actual full acronym that at least most people say, not that there's not more, but it's LGBTQQIAAP.
Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah, which a friend of mine actually compared to, trying to remember the numbers of pi, as far as you can go. And so it's not really super practical. And of course, those things stand for individual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, pansexual, and a bunch of other things. And we've also definitely forgot a few other things. So, so basically there's been a real big movement with a lot of organizations to basically just say, hey, let's stop naming each and every type of person because we're going to forget somebody, or we're going to put them in an order that people don't like, and we're going to, it's going to be confusing. So we're going to say queer throughout the rest of the episode in everything, but except for maybe some quotes from direct articles.
It's interesting. The other day, there was something in the news, and I was talking to my dad about it, and it was something about the LGBTQ plus community and using the word queer. And he asked me, he's like, I thought that was, offensive. I thought that was a slur. And I'm like, well, no, it's not anymore. And he asked me what it meant. And I couldn't answer that. I knew it wasn't within the same context that it used to be. So coming into this episode, that was automatically something that, I needed to learn for myself.
Well, in the 90s, there was a show called Queer as Folk. I've never watched it myself. I probably should at some point, but it actually was, it really helped the popularity of the word and to take it back. And I understand that some people are still offended by the word, particularly people who are older who, had it yelled at them or whatever. But it is generally gaining acceptance, and I think it's a much easier way to go about it.
And now we have the second generation of the show Queer Eye as well.
Yeah, we do.
Exactly.
We do.
I forgot about that.
I love Queer Eye. It's such a good show.
And Kara, do you want to handle the next one?
Yep. So our second primer that we've got at the top of the episode. So the queer movement represents a lot of, related but very unique people. And it seems like a lot of that bigotry and hatred toward the queer movement is typically stemming from confusion for what seems to be an endless, changing, and growing redefinition of what society thought was understood. And if you're frustrated by it as a straight person or someone trying to understand this movement, imagine how hard it is for the person who's questioning themselves and trying to navigate this. So we're going to try to define it, break it down, and understand what the average person, queer or not, needs to know to better understand their world.
I think that's so important because I feel like a struggle between, the anti-LGBTQ, or not even anti, but, the people who don't really understand it. Like a big reason for that is it seems like it's changing constantly. And I know for myself, someone who's fairly ignorant on this topic, there are so many terms and so many things that I haven't kept up on. So I'd hear these different words and these different phrases and whatnot, and it's been tough to keep up on, but it's something that as a minority group that, they're fighting to have recognized and have understood within a larger community.
And you know what? It's no secret that ignorance creates a lot of fear. That does not mean that something is bad. It might just mean that you're maybe uneducated about it and it's scary because you don't know. So maybe get educated and it won't be as scary and you won't hate it as much.
Yeah, I mean, imagine though, going through your whole life like thinking that you hate a type of person when really you don't even understand what you hate. Right. I think that's probably the case in a lot of people. And so I'm hoping that if they're listening right now, to what we're recording right now, that they're ready to sort of like dip their toe into this, and it's totally fine if you get it completely wrong and you have to correct yourself or whatever. The mere act of trying is so important. I remember when I was taking French, the language French. I asked my instructor, I said, my French isn't very good. Like, if I go to France, are they going to think I'm rude for saying these words wrong? And she said, no, they'll appreciate you tried. And I thought that was so
Curtis,
cool.
That's funny. That was the exact example I was thinking of. So great minds think alike. Cool. That's such an obscure example for us both to come to, but it's a great one.
It works. It
really works. They do. They care. They'll talk to you if you just at least say, bullshit.
Yeah, right.
Can't speak anything else than that.
Not, where the local McDonald's at?
God damn it, I'm an
American food in Paris.
I remember when I was in Germany, I was in Munich, and I was so excited to use German. I was so happy. And I go into my hotel, and I'm like, "Hello, and immediately she starts speaking English, and I was like, "Man."
She was happy that you tried. The hollow was really good.
I was very excited, but that's okay. At least I tried, and that's what we're hoping that within the podcast, that's something that we can do and hopefully our listeners can do moving forward. But rolling off of that into primer number 3, terms change. Understanding of sexuality and gender changes over time. This may mean this could be outdated in a few years, and that's really okay. As a society, we should learn new understandings and actively try to change based on that new information. We shouldn't have to wait for a generation shift for change and progress to happen. Be lifelong learners. And with that, let's begin. Something that we all need to understand is that people choosing to question their sexuality or gender is nothing new. There's this kind of grand idea that it started in the 1960s, but really that's just not true. Queer people throughout the ages, people choosing to question their sexuality or gender is nothing new, but how we treat these people and how their freedom to question have changed many times. Really, how we treat them starts at a very young age, and with very simple things, and something that we might not think about are two things that kind of happen pretty often, which are the color blue and the color pink. So, Curtis, going into that, can you explain really how that came to be?
Yeah, people generally think, blue is for boys, pink is for girls. That's kind of just normal. That we want to know instantly when we see a baby, what their sex is. So a lot of times they'll have, like a little like the headband or something, that signifies, what sex they are immediately or whatever. But it's funny because these things change over time, and in your parents' or grandparents' lifetime, it's completely flipped. In the old days, blue was actually the color for girls, and pink was actually the color for boys. It was exactly the opposite. And the quote from the article I read, it was from a 1918 article from the trade publication Earnshaw's Infants Department, said, quote, "The generally accepted rule is pink for boys and blue for girls. The reason is pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for a boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl." So obviously it's a super sexist statement. but the point is, you can justify a norm however you like, and it works just the same as today as the idea of pink being dainty or whatever. And even this whole stupid movement, which it's kind of progressive, but it also is kind of like hard to, it's not really caught up with the times, in my opinion. Is this idea of tough enough to wear pink, like apparently, pink was the color for boys according to 1918 advertisements or whatever. So how tough do you really need to be? But so anyway, it changes over time, and so a lot of the things that we're told I'm literally from birth, is just a lot of assumptions, a lot of things that don't really have any founding in absolute law or anything like that. So so when somebody questions these things, when they change their mind, when society changes, it's not as radical as it really seems. At one time, women wearing pants was like a crazy idea. It was so inappropriate, and women would get arrested for it and beat up for it.
So
all these
crazy.
different things. So first of all, I guess the point is kind of like drop your whole thing about oh, this is the way it's always been, because I'm willing to bet you that it's not.
It was after the Industrial Revolution, and in this article, it's the Smithsonian magazine article, and it's when did girls start wearing pink? Pretty straightforward. And I think this is the same article that you were referencing, talking about the 1918 article, and it says in 1927, Time magazine printed a chart that literally showed sex-appropriate colors for girls and boys according to leading U.S. stores. And I think this was kind of a big transition into consumerism and really the ability for Americans to kind of rely on these, big manufacturers and whatnot, and really especially leading into the 1940s and into the 1950s. All the trends, what clothing, colors, everything was decided basically by, the companies, by the manufacturers, the people who were... It
was a marketing ploy.
It absolutely was.
You had to buy clothes twice because people used to use the same clothing for kids up to a certain age, at least, whether or not they were a boy or a girl. It was accepted up until about, I think, age 5 or 6 that you would be dressed in basically a dress, even if you were a boy. And so it was a marketing thing to be like, no, you don't want your boy in a dress. You got to, buy them this blue, pair of pants or whatever. So you can't be thrifty and just use the clothes over again.
I do want to point something out too, and this is my opinion, but I think it's I think it's valid. There's a lot of talk, especially right now in our society, about, you know, people that are quote unquote like a majority or minorities, things like that. If you look at, we just talked about how, you know, it was a marketing gimmick to change, you know, the colors for your gender. And at some point, the majority of people, which is to say at this point, and still at this point, you know, probably straight people, most likely white straight people, decided we're doing it this way now. And minority people or people who didn't agree with that had to fit in that box, or they were like weird or persecuted or wrong. And so it's just kind of crazy how at some point the majority people, you know, or people who have a bigger voice or something like that say, actually, we're going to do it this way now. And if you don't subscribe to it, you're the wrong one. It's like, but we were just doing it the other way. And I liked that. So I think that's interesting too, is you just constantly have to be fitting into these little boxes unless we allow more room for discussion of these things.
I was just going to say, it really wasn't until the 1960s when, especially for women, this gender-neutral clothing became acceptable. You know, prior to then, everyone fit in their roles. It was this intensely patriarchal system that, you know, was running through the country from the 40s to the 50s. And, you know, everyone had their place, and that's how it worked. And it really wasn't until the 60s when that kind of stepped away. And, you know, especially because the 60s was this mile marker for social change in our country.
The thing I find, the more I look through history and question why things are, you know, the more I understand that so many things that seem like it happened organically over time actually happened from a very like purposeful, like direct way, or for a direct reason. Like for this, you know, with that, it was basically a marketing ploy. Like it didn't just happen. People didn't just decide to start doing it.
Yes.
You know, and you find that in history over and over again, where like something that seemed like it just happened or whatever was actually very purposefully done, and usually done for somebody's benefit, and a lot of times done for somebody else's detriment.
And when you think about the fact that a marketing gimmick might have caused, you know, girls wearing blue pants or boys wearing, you know, pink dresses or something to be bullied or to be called, you know, names, is there's consequences to those kinds of actions. And so I think it's a good idea for us to challenge our own thoughts next time we think something is weird or out of the norm. And it's like, but why do you think that? Who told you that it's, you know, weird or out of the norm? So I think it's good to keep in the back of our minds at all times.
Curtis, you mentioned that up until the late 1800s, at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, like I was saying, you know, there's pictures of FDR in 1882 at age 2 wearing a dress, because at the time it was gender neutral, and it was clothing for children specifically were chosen out of practicality. You know, you'd have, you know, kid ages, you know, 1 to 6 wearing these white skirts and dresses because, one, you don't have to worry about stains. You can just bleach it, and you don't have to worry about different colors, and it's just easier to clean up your kid. It's easier to, you know, just change them out if they get messy or whatever.
I mean, think about that idea today. You know, it's like, you know, be more practical. Dress your boy in a dress. You know, I mean, like, and people would go crazy over that.
The key perspective of that, there was a switch.
Normal.
And they talk about it in this Smithsonian magazine article, where they say there was a switch from we dress our children like this out of practicality to where there was this concern that, oh no, you know, if I dress my child in these gender neutral or these, you know, quote unquote opposite gender clothing, they're going to turn out to have these, you know, mental issues that were perceived at the time. And so all of a sudden there was a switch where it's not like, oh, this is practical for, you know, my 6-year-old son to wear this skirt, to where, oh, if my 6-year-old son wears a skirt, he's going to turn out to be gay. And that was a huge concern in America because there was this like intense heterosexual normativity that was across the country, and anything that went against that was deemed immoral. It was deemed deviant. And
people didn't even, you know, they didn't even read about gay people or trans people or lesbians. You know, that wasn't like it is today. You know, like they rarely even heard the term, and they may not have even of understood exactly what it meant, because a lot of times, even if it did get written about, you know, it would be, you know, say something like, you know, perverts arrested or something like that. It didn't, you know, specify that, you know, it was because, you know, this quote unquote pervert or whatever was wearing, not enough of their gender normative like clothing. There was like a law that you had to wear like three articles of your appropriate gender normal clothing, or you could be arrested in New York City. Like that's so stupid, but you could be called a pervert for that.
Moving off of that, and that actually goes very well into the next section of how the community was treated and how various societies thought of them. And like I said, there's this intense heteronormative idea that just America thrives on. And to pin it to a point, and granted, the struggle for LGBTQ peoples has been one that's been through the ages. Like we said, it's not a 20th century issue. It's something that's always been around, and it's a myth that all of a sudden it just popped up. But this heteronormative idea really set its staples in American history, specifically in the American frontier. And I talk about this because in this book, and it's written by Peter Bogue, it's called Redressing America's Frontier Past. And it's a fascinating quote in the book. And he says, on the one hand, in the late 19th century, male to female cross-dressing was effectively removed from the defining narratives of the American West in the frontier, and thus the nation. On the other hand, male-to-female cross-dressing was obviously central in a furtive sort of way to the creation of these narratives. And so what he's saying there basically is there's this intense heteronormative, just masculine, manly man narrative that was created in the American frontier, but really a large part of that is because of LGBTQ perspective and the LGBTQ community that was really alive and well then. But it was just completely taken out of the narrative because it was just so out of the ordinary and really just so not accepted at the time.
And our perception of that time period is really shaped by, cowboy movies and all that stuff that even further, push the very macho, narrative that really wasn't as true as they, show.
And so Peter Bogue, what he points out is that basically the narrative accepts female to male cross-dressers at the time. And in the book, Peter Bogue, he talks about Bernard S. Talmy. He was a New York physician, and he wrote this medical article in 1914 called Transvestism, a contribution to the study of the psychology of sex. And in this article, Talmy met with 4 different people and wrote about their case studies, and one specifically referenced in the book is about this person, M. And historians don't know M by anything other than M. And M was a boy, a man who, and at the time during the case study, he was in, I believe, his early 20s. And he dressed in women's clothing. That's what he didn't identify as a woman per se, and he didn't consider himself homosexual or participate in sexual acts with someone of the same gender. He was somebody who just felt more comfortable and more themselves in women's clothing. And actually, there's a quote from Talmy that says, talking about when M was dressed in women's clothing, that when so dressed, I can always think more logically, feel less encumbered, solve difficult problems in a manner next to impossible under any other conditions. And so what Peter Bogue goes on to discuss in this book, specifically regarding male to female cross-dressers, was that there were exceptions made in the sense that there were examples of men cross-dressing as women in mining towns where it's 216 men and 4 women. So some of the younger men dress as women so that everyone had a dancing partner. Or there's example of
that's extremely sweet, by the way.
It's very
that's like the
thoughtful.
sweetest way for
sweet.
society to change.
Everyone just wants to, have a friend to dance with. But it's, it's similar to Shakespearean times when women weren't allowed on stage. So, men acted as the women. But it was really driven by newspapers and propaganda, basically, where they worked very hard to basically put this idea of cross-dressers and put this idea of non-heteronormative ways to the fringe, just to the peripherals of the American West, which over time, the American West kind of became the example of America, of the United States. ways they did that as well was racializing it. So basically pushing these acts on Native Americans and Hispanics, and really trying to basically keep the, white Anglo-Saxon Americans in the West, quote unquote, pure.
So when you say they are pushing this agenda daily, you're talking about the straight white men in America.
Yes, I'm talking about Anglo-Saxons.
Yes.
Well, it's crazy, that whole account at first seems surprising that it goes back that far, but really it shouldn't be, because if you think about it throughout history, any society that was untamed, queer people were thriving. It's only when we try to sort of start putting ourselves in a box of who are we and who aren't we, that somebody, raises their hand and says, I don't think this type of person is us, and I don't think that type of person is us. So it kind of makes sense.
It was this attitude towards these male crossdressers in the American West that really led to laws and how politicians and how the government viewed them. And ultimately, later on in the early 20th century, it led on to things like laws of indecency.
Yeah. There's been so many.
Specifically, one we know here kind of pairs up with the Red Scare, or something called the Lavender Scare.
Which, by the way, is maybe the best historical term that has ever been created. I mean, I don't know if it originally was meant to be a kind of a slur or not. I'm not really sure who created that term, but but it is it's basically queerifying the Red Scare and calling it the Lavender Scare, which it's crazy because it's the term itself is funny, but then when you actually know what it is, it's
horrifying.
Not funny at all. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know where it came from, but it makes me laugh every time, and that's probably good because you're gonna need a laugh with everything that happened. Just to bridge it just a little bit with what you were saying, I kind of call this whole time before, say, 1969, which you're going to know why that is important in a second. But this whole time before 1969, I kind of call queer prehistory. I think it would be kind of if you think of year zero basically being 1969, this is all the stuff that led up to the change. So
in America in particular, right, is what we're referencing.
Yes, yeah, and we are referencing. We're almost completely talking about American queer history in this,
because we have a really weird relationship with sexuality in America that not every single country struggles with.
Which we will continue to dive in within this episode.
That's true, and I guess the biggest thing to point out would be the Lavender Scare. So that basically lasted from 1945. It wasn't completely eradicated from our law books until 1975, although it was much looser by that point, and a lot of the things weren't being followed by that point. But basically, it was connected to the communist scare, McCarthyism. If you're not familiar, basically there was absolute hysteria in Washington and therefore in the rest of the country, about communists taking over the country by infiltrating it from within, and that basically that capitalism could be easily taken over, which of course is kind of a myth. One of the reasons we like capitalism so much is that it's not something that is easily taken over, but whatever. So it was this idea that that within our own government, there were people that were already communists and they were already working against us and spying on us. And some of it was true because, the Cold War kind of proved that it was, as far as people, spying and stuff. But a lot of it was used as basically just propaganda to take away people that you thought undesirable. It was essentially the modern day witch hunt of mostly innocent people. At the worst, they may have attended some meetings and maybe called themselves a communist because, especially if they were being mistreated, or mislabeled or something in society, it probably seemed pretty nice to go to a system that at least in the description that they were being given was so much more accepting of who they were. And it was actually a government led witch hunt that was trying to get the federal workforce completely free of undesirables, including queer people, because the thought process was that if they were queer, that they could be easily blackmailed, and that they probably weren't good people anyway, which sounded a lot like what people were calling communists in general, and that, you know, if we sniffed them out and we shamed them and we got them out of government and we, you know, maybe even changed them back to being straight or something, that we would somehow be safer in the country. And so there was says in 1947, the U.S. Park Police initiated in I guess some of the cities, the sex perversion elimination program targeting gay men for arrest and intimidation. A year later, Congress passed an act, quote, for the treatment of sexual psychopaths in the nation's capital.
Psychopaths.
I don't know. They sound fun. I want to hang out with them.
Sexual psychopaths.
Sounds like a fun gay bar now,
right?
But anyway,
oh my god.
But that law facilitated the arrest and punishment of people who acted on same-sex desire and labeled them as mentally ill. Homosexuality was perceived at that time as a lurking subversive threat. So McCarthy was a famous figure, real asshole, honestly.
Yeah, McCarthy sucked.
Tell us how you really
who basically was, you know, he just in some cases lied completely about, you know, having lists of people that were, you know, anti-American and all this stuff, and he was just using the scare tactics to basically get his way.
Mm-hmm. He's here saying, you know, McCarthy implied that men who were part of the queer community were susceptible to communist recruitment because as homosexuals, they had what he called peculiar mental twists. Just Americans ate this up. So much of what McCarthy spewed out, Americans just ate up. And that's, you know, we had the Hollywood blacklist. We had political blacklists, and just people were their lives were being just completely uplifted and destroyed, mostly off of just completely backless claim.
Fear and scaring people can make them believe a lot of things, and we got to remember that, because you have a lot of power over someone if they're scared of something, and that's essentially how he was able to kind of make this claim and make people believe it so much.
Yeah, and it was the ignorance of who these people were, and even the understanding of sexuality and how it changes in people that allowed this to happen as well. You know, I mean, if you don't know what it is, it seems scary. There was a letter that was sent out to all government agencies.
Yeah. I
mean, this sounds so. It's ironically, like, you know, these acts sound like, you know, what you hear about in like the worst, like fascist, you know, like communist, like, you know, countries examples that they give or whatever. So they, in trying to stop it, they basically turned into it. But like, you know, the government agencies got a letter that basically said, quote, "The privilege of working for the United States government should not be extended to persons of dubious moral character, such as homosexuals and sex perverts. The confidence of our citizenry in their government would be severely taxed if we looked with tolerance upon the employment of such persons." So basically, they just riled them all out. You know, they just. And one thing I thought was especially like terrible was not only did they like arrest people who were caught for, you know, having some kind of sexual act or just some kind of like, you know, what they thought was different than the normative, and then they would be fired if they were a government worker. But there were also a lot of people who actually resigned from their job because they didn't want to go through the scrutiny of their sexuality. Mm-hmm. And they actually went to the trouble of looking through those files and making sure that nobody resigned for anything but like a good reason. Like, and if you didn't have like
good reason,
an acceptable reason, whatever reason you gave, like they would basically interrogate you to say, you know, well, was it because you might actually be gay? And if you said yes, again, you know, they would punish you, and they would make sure you'd never work again in government. And they, you know, they would do things like go to your job, your future jobs or whatever, and try to, you know, have an intervention or whatever. Like they'd tell your new boss that you were gay and that and that, did they know that, and are they okay with that and all that, and they'll get you fired again. Like they were just after these people. They didn't want them to exist. They didn't want them to have any way of like supporting themselves. And unfortunately, it led a lot of people to killing themselves and to, hiding their heads in the sand for another decade or two, because they were scared that, further agitation would make their lives even worse or would affect their families. So this effectively like suppressed an entire generation of people from questioning or from at least being open about it in public, especially at work, especially with their family. So know that, being gay and the whole movement, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was being actively suppressed, from the beginning.
It's hard to ignore the irony that you pointed out, how while trying to stop communism and fascism, they kind of took on attributes of those two things. And for example, there's a man we'll talk about later on, Henry Harry Hay Jr., who's noted as American gay rights activist, communist, and labor advocate, who founded the first kind of sustained gay rights group in America. And later on in that group's existence, he left because he was part of the Communist Party. And while early on in his career, while trying to join the United States Communist Party, they rejected him because the party didn't want gay people in the Communist Party. And so he basically kind of shoved that all down and ended up marrying a female member of the party to try and basically, cover up his sexuality so that he could be part of the Communist Party. And then later on, he ended up, like I said, he got kicked out of his own gay rights organization because he was a communist. So it's just this irony in there that you just can't be ignored.
No, not that type of communism. This type of communism. That's
right, literally, though.
There's a great quote when they're talking about like basically sifting out like how to sift out gay people who didn't just come forward or weren't just caught. Like they were obsessed with this, and the line from this it's Senator Smith asked a psychologist, quote, "So there's no quick test like an X-ray that discloses these things?"
Oh no!
Goodness.
I mean, wow. Imagine an X-ray, oh, by the way, like you're healthy, but you're gay. Sorry.
There's a little rainbow on your femur bone, so
yeah.
you're actually gay. We saw it on the X-ray.
I wonder what that would, so we're moving into a Black Mirror future right now. I wonder what that would do to society if there was literally some kind of a, things you could attach to your baby's head and it could determine what their gender and what their sexuality would, turn out to be as they grew up. Like,
scarily, they're actually trying to do that.
Are they really?
Yeah, there's theories that there are certain genes that make you more susceptible to having like, I don't know, like I guess like more likely to be gay or something like that. I don't think I really don't think that the science is that great on it, but there is some theory, there is a little bit of evidence to support it. And the scary thing might be that, in the future, there might be a time of eradicating people who are different, and they can actually tell pretty early. Just to move it on a little bit, like in the one of the really important pivotal moments that I don't think a lot of people really realize of why the queer community have been so like mistreated and made to feel like criminals was because in 1952 the American Psychiatric Association they actually gave the official classification of homosexuality as, quote, sociopathic personality disturbance. So they actually fell into this idea that it was something that was a mental disorder. And so, and like at the time, I understand they thought that they were actually doing a service because if it was something that was like a disorder, the idea was, well, maybe we can fix these people. Maybe we shouldn't just throw them out. Maybe we can sort of rehabilitate them. But what it did was it really stigmatized and this entire generation of people, not just as people questioning who they were, but that they were actually sick, and that legally, or ended up becoming legally, they could be even institutionalized and all kinds of different things.
It's interesting too, because just to really show how far branching this whole idea was, even during World War II in Great Britain, there was, who was it? He was the guy who broke Enigma.
Are you talking about the guy that the movie was based on?
Alan Turing, who was basically employed by the British government with some other mathematicians and scientists to break the German Enigma so that they could figure out what the Germans were doing. He became a known homosexual. He ended up by law being punished for it, and it was either he could spend time in prison or he would have to take these pills that would literally castrate him.
Oh my God.
And he took these pills and it just destroyed him. And this is the man that basically beat the Germans behind the scenes. He invented he was the godfather of the computer. And
he's a genius.
Absolute genius who saved countless lives. But because he was gay, the government that he worked for and the government that he served and the people he served literally took away his sexuality.
This is documented in the movie The Imitation Game.
Yes,
by
great
the way.
Great movie. He is depicted by Benedict Cumberbatch.
I think it's important to remember that there are very real consequences for created or artificial stigmas or ideas. The world, unfortunately, is missing a lot of really amazing, smart people because we decided to normalize this hatred and bigotry towards gay people and queer people.
I mean, what else is America but like the freedom to sort of be yourself, that we understand that having differences of opinion actually make us stronger, where somebody will have an idea that you would have never thought of in a million years because they're coming from a completely different background. To me, that's like patriotism, like in a nutshell.
I so agree. That was one of my first thoughts when we were doing this episode, because I know that there is a lot of people that when they think of America, that either think of it as a very open place or they think of it as really, uptight Christian country, whatever. But I'm like, it does seem so American to me that you can be who you want to be and love who you want to love and everyone mind your own business. And that it's so weird to me that we have strayed from that, because I agree, Curtis. It totally seems so American to be able to do what you want to do. It's weird. I don't know. I don't understand how we strayed so far from that.
Similar around this time in the late 1940s, there was this committee that was put together and they issued a report called The Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government, which that language in itself is just...
It's so intentional.
There's just no care. It is just straight and to the point of, you can read that title and you know what the report's going to be.
Exactly.
But
the government still does that to this day. Every bill has, it's the, Make America Great Again bill or something. And it's like, well, we'll see. Let's read this. I'm not exactly sure if that title's accurate, but I'm pretty sure I know what it's going to say.
What the committee found within this report was during the preceding 3 years, close to 5,000 homosexuals had been detected in the military and civilian workforces. This ultimately led to Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1953 Executive Order number 10450, Security Requirements for Government Employment. The order explicitly added sexuality to the criteria used to determine suitability for federal employment, which ultimately banned gay men and lesbians from all jobs in U.S. government, federal, local, state,
and trans people.
Yeah.
And it basically just
the queer community.
If there's anybody different, we don't want you in government. That's basically what it said.
Yeah.
Because you're a security threat, apparently.
Historians estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and it says and up to tens of thousands of gay workers lost their jobs. And the reason that it's hard to estimate is because the official report says something like 5,000 or something that they had, successfully rooted out or whatever. But it's so hard to know like how many people just left their jobs, how many people never got into government, how many people stayed in whatever government job they were and didn't try to advance because they were afraid of being further scrutinized. It was really a time where people kind of just, put their head down and hoped that nobody would notice them.
It's interesting because, and it's marked here that, and if you look back, there's a reason we know about the Red Scare and not really the Lavender Scare. And with the Red Scare, people who were suspected communists were just lambasted. It was public. Everyone was publicly ridiculed. But with the Lavender Scare specifically, it was kind of kept quiet. And maybe that was because the government didn't want to admit that they had queer people working with them. They thought it would make them look bad.
It was also because they were more successful at rooting out gay people than they were of communists. Like, it turned out the whole root scare that started out, had so little proof, and there was so few actual examples that they could point to after all these investigations, after all these people had lost their jobs and their lives, that eventually people started saying BS, that you prove it, which is what they should have said to begin with when McCarthy started pointing fingers at people. But then again, there were these queer people who actually were queer. They were correct that they were queer. They just weren't correct that it was something wrong about it. And so they were so successful with it, and that it lasted much longer than the Red Scare really affected the majority of Americans.
And I guess maybe that makes sense too with the government, and McCarthy had to be louder about the Red Scare to make it perceived as a more true and real threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like a quick side note, we're gonna jump to modern times. I just thought this was a great little piece of information. In 2020, Trump actually was the person that appointed the first openly gay person. His name was Richard. Or is, I'm not sure if he's still there, who knows, but Richard Grenell, to lead the intelligence community, which was the same institution that persecuted the people for being gay during the Lavender Scare, until the executive order was signed to end Eisenhower's executive order in 1995 by Bill Clinton. And so officially, the whole thing didn't officially end until 1995 when it was actually taken out of the books, but up until 1975, at least, it was somewhat being used in government.
Let's move a little bit into how they were kind of shamed and how they were considered mentally ill from so many different standpoints and so many different people.
Yeah, one of the perceptions, I think, from a lot of straight people, especially if you were, grew up in the 90s or something where they had the don't ask, don't tell thing, was basically okay, you can be who you are, just don't put it in my face or whatever. And that, it's a dumb argument anyway, but even if it were true, you have to understand that throughout history, gay people have been tricked out of coming out and basically shamed for doing it, up until, the Pride movement started later on. But at first it was an obsession of the government to out people, and not just in government jobs. There was something called the Comstock Act, which basically gave the USPS, which is still actually in effect, by the way, I believe, gives the USPS the authority to stop obscenity from going through the mail. Even though it's in effect, the idea of what is obscene has changed quite a bit over time and continues to change. So at the time in the 1950s and 60s, the USPS was actually in the business of opening people's mail who they thought were maybe guilty of these illegal acts of being homosexual, or being obscene, and whether it meant being trans or anything that they considered to be obscene. And when they did this, they would actually arrest people for sending private mail to somebody else that had something obscene, and they could legally get away with this.
Could you imagine, in today's context, you're a guy sexting with a guy, you're a girl sexting with a girl, whatever, and you can be arrested for what you say in those text messages? That's wild.
Yeah, it's one of the scariest possible outcomes that the government monitoring, being able to legally monitor Americans, how outcome that it could happen, and there's definitely a precedent of them doing it with the mail in a much less efficient way, and getting away with it for a long time. Thankfully, there were a lot of people that fought against it based on ideas of constitutionality, if for nothing else, which slowed it down or stopped it, and actually allowed gay people a little bit of freedom to express themselves, especially in private, in private mail, things like that.
I just want to quickly point out the irony of the U.S. government, making official government documents deeming these people as perverts, yet they were so obsessed with people's sex life that they were ripping open their private letters to figure out what was going on. Like, why are you so obsessed? It was a little ironic.
Well, because for those Anglo-Saxon Christians, it went against their beliefs, and their beliefs were often pretty paralleled with the law.
And then that little thing called church and separation of state just goes away.
Yeah, I mean, so many early laws were made, in direct relation to people's religious beliefs, which makes sense. I mean, that they would do that. But in America, we're not supposed to do that. It doesn't matter, if you're of the same religion or not. You're not supposed to have jurisdiction over somebody else's private life, just because you don't think it's correct. But a lot of those things were never actually enforced, or a lot of gay people didn't want to come out and say that their rights were being taken away.
Well, it's interesting too, because looking back, you have down here, back in the high Middle Ages, homosexual acts at least seemed to be tolerated or just completely ignored by the Christian church throughout Europe. And it really wasn't until the later end of the 12th century that all of a sudden this hostility towards homosexuality started. How that started, I don't know. I think we talked on a previous episode, or maybe just talking while we were discussing this episode, that, with the Bible, there's a whole thing where a man shall not lay with another man, but there's evidence that points towards the original words of that section of the Bible say a man shall not lay with a child. And so at some point, rather than pedophilia, it got switched to homosexuality.
But also, I mean, if you go to any art museum, or if you have any interest in art from way back in the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, it's a very free, type of sexuality. There's women laying with other women and men laying and everyone laying together. And it clearly wasn't that big of a deal back then if there was paintings and or maybe it was, and, they were being difficult apparently. But there's so many paintings of that. Art was very, seemed sexually fluid back then. So it is interesting. At one point, they were like, no more of that.
Yeah, and at some point too, America really had a switch for a lot of different on a lot of different topics. You'll find that science really started taking over as sort of the de facto judge of what should be a law, what shouldn't be outlawed. And rather than necessarily just saying, well, it's in the Bible, you had to say, well, why does the fact that it's in the Bible have anything to do with this person who may or may not be of your religion? So slowly things like psychiatrists and they started really putting in their 2 cents with their studies, and it actually did change how laws were being made. Again, it was sort of thought of as a mercy and a more civilized way of being, but still it was under the guise of, let's help this mentally ill person, not maybe this person is just having a different experience than I am.
For people who are against, at least, back in the time that we're speaking of, when it comes to homosexuality and, the queer community, so many of the arguments against it were based off of non-procreativity and, basically things that just went against the natural selection of humans of this is what benefits humanity is man and woman having sex. So, why should you be allowed to do this? This is not normal.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, it goes back to that practicality thing of, it's well, why would you, want to have sex in any way, but in, the man being on top or whatever, that was there were a lot of social norms that were being broken by even changing sex positions and all that. It would be you could be arrested for a woman being on top and during sex or something, stuff like that I was reading about. There were all these ideas of you should definitely do it like this, and it was oh great, we're really being like super free in this new land of America with all these rules about what we can do and what we can't.
And it was really in the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s when psychology and the study of the brain and the study of the mind, the study of people really kind of started to take off more. And you had people like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, he wrote, I guess it was a medical article or a book, Psychopathia Sexualis, where he describes homosexuality as degenerative sickness. But then you have people like Sigmund Freud and, how do you say that, Havelock Ellis?
Havelock, if you want to look it up later.
Havelock Ellis sounds right to me.
Yeah, we'll say Havelock Ellis, where they really both adapted more acceptable stances on homosexuality in the queer community.
Yeah, and then and then jump forward a little bit, and basically the American Psychiatric Association gave these recommendations, and they had all these studies like starting in the 50s. Where they were the first to question these ideas of like homosexuals being anti-adjusted to society. And this is a quote from one of the articles.
Is anti-adjusted a term basically describing like that they won't assimilate?
Yeah, kind of like there was this idea that like in order to be a good adult, you needed to adjust or assimilate to society, and if you couldn't do that, there was something mentally wrong with you.
Yeah, and especially
with you, it's not in a society, which is crazy. It's like, sorry, you didn't come with us when we changed our mind about the blue and pink thing, so you're not interested anymore. Sorry.
Right. There's a great episode of The Simpsons where Homer accidentally puts his white shirt in with something pink. And like it comes out as a pink shirt, and it's his only shirt, and he has to wear it to work, and he actually gets written up at work for being like a crazy hippie, like trying to change the the norm or whatever. And he's like I forgot who was supposed to have done it, but like my daughter put it in there, like
good old Simpson satire.
Episode. Yeah.
It's interesting, you say, it's your responsibility as, an adult in America to assimilate, and especially while we're talking about sexuality. And like I said, when so many of the arguments against it were, the need to procreate, and I'm sure they would argue that, it's your responsibility as a human, as, someone who's part of the society to be a part of procreation. And by, sleeping with a man or, sleeping with someone of the same sex, you are not being a responsible adult.
There's a great line in the movie Milk which is about a gay icon, Harvey Milk.
Yeah.
But there's a great line that is meant to be completely tongue in cheek. Like it's not meant to be taken seriously at all. But like basically the person who ends up assassinating him near the end of the movie and did in real life, ask him a question. He says, can a man, or, can two men have procreate? Can they have a child? And Harvey Milk's line in the movie is, no, but we keep trying. Which is, I hope he actually said that in real life, but probably didn't, but it's hilarious.
It's a wonderful line.
There was a landmark study by Evelyn Hooker, who studied 30 homosexual males and 30 heterosexual males that she recruited through community organizations. The two groups were matched for age, IQ, and education, and none of the men were in therapy at the time of the study. So Dr. Hooker administered 3 tests, projective tests, which measured people's patterns of thoughts, attitudes, and emotions. And then basically she turned it over to independent research company and had them rate the overall adjustment of who were considered to be the most healthy of that group on a scale from 1 to 5 of being
1 to pi.
1 to 5 of how adjusted are they or whatever.
Yeah.
And basically and then after they did that, they said, okay, which ones of these people are heterosexual and which ones are homosexual? And what it proved was that there actually was no significant difference of adjustment between a healthy homosexual and a healthy heterosexual. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the first studies that actually questioned this idea that a lot of people had just taken for granted.
And the test they did one called the thematic apperception test, which is that stereotypical cliche thing where look at this ink blot and tell me what you see. And then there's another one called it's literally make a picture story, and it's called the MAPS test, and it's people look at a picture and they have to tell a story based off that picture. And like you said, these people conducted these tests, and they had two independent experts who did the first test, and then they had another independent expert who did the other one. They got experts for the two specific tests. And as you said, by the end, they couldn't determine who was homosexual and who was heterosexual with any more accuracy than just chance. So the determination by the end was that basically
maybe they're just normal people.
Yeah, like there is no psychological difference between heterosexual and homosexual people. They still, everyone can still think the same. Everyone can still have the same cognitive functions. It's just, the sexuality is different.
I do want to make sure we mention too, and Curtis, you have some great quotes on here about this, that just because, obviously, yes, gay people, queer people, surprise, surprise, they can think like normal people. But that's not to say that in the queer community, you won't find instances of, mental illness or depression and things like that, because of the fact that it creates a lot of trauma and stress. Mm-hmm. If you were living a life which you can't be yourself, or you're sent to conversion therapy, or you lose your job because, of your the way that you choose to love someone. So correlation does not equal causation. So we probably do find, and we see it with, unfortunately, suicide rates and things of that nature, higher levels of some type of mental illness. But that's not because if you're born gay, you are also born depressed. That might just be because you have a lot of stresses and trauma surrounding the community you're in. Exactly. So I think that's really important to mention.
A nice thing too, I'd say a nice thing, because of the work of Evelyn Hooker and because of the stances made by Freud and many other people studying the human mind, the American Psychiatrists Association actually apologized for mislabeling queer people as mentally ill in 2019. So the fact that they were able to go back and be like, we were wrong.
We really messed up.
And we're gonna find that like over and over in what we're talking about today, in that like it takes a long time, and it's probably too late in a lot of cases because a lot of damage has been done. But at the same time, like, people do feel legitimately sorry. These are people that, like, in some cases were the people who made these judgments 50 years ago, and at the end of their life, one of their biggest regrets is making a mistake that caused so much damage.
I mean, it causes generational trauma when these kinds of things happen. So hopefully, now that they have, in 2019, that was literally last year, even though it feels like it was 20 billion years ago, because 2020 has been a Groundhog Day. That will last a long time. That apology is very important, and it goes a long way, but there's a lot more work to do to fix the damage that caused. They did just go away because of that apology, like you guys were saying.
Thankfully, people did start speaking up. Studies did start backing up what people knew to be true, who were queer, that that there was nothing wrong with them, that they that they basically were just like anyone else.
And honestly, a big part of that, and we talk about the trauma that some of these people have faced, and some of that trauma and the struggles and the issues that the queer community saw that they didn't really have answers for, was really something that provoked Alfred Kinsey into creating the Kinsey scale. If you haven't seen it, there's a movie called Kinsey, and Alfred Kinsey is played by Liam Neeson, and it's a fantastic film. But Alfred Kinsey was an American biologist, actually, and a professor of entomology and zoology and sexology in the 1940s. And a lot of his early research was honestly on I think fruit flies or some kind of a bug. And then his interest quickly turned into human sexuality, which led him to writing I guess he probably had more books, but the two kind of big ones that are known are Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, as well as Sexual Behavior in the Human Female.
Basically, it tried to measure a person's overall balance of heterosexuality and homosexuality. And what it really challenged was that, that the sexuality isn't simply a binary. And what that means, and by the way, I did not know what the word binary meant until I was studying for this. I was my whole life I went without knowing what it meant. Basically, binary means it's either one or the other. It's two things,
right?
And so it's either male, female. That would be a binary. That's an example. But or it can be a 1 or a 0, just like you get the binary in a computer. But it can never be anything else. And so what this really questioned was whether or not it was simply a binary, or maybe could it be sort of a gradual, from 0 to 6, you could fall anywhere on this spectrum. Maybe nobody or very few people were exclusively one way or the other, and he really went to great lengths to make sure that he would test this out. And there's a great quote that Kinsey wrote saying, males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats, like meaning there's a lot of animals in the wild, and that, it doesn't have to be one or the other.
We look at all these people who studied sexuality and studied gender, at that time. And from my research of Kinsey and the movie that I watched based on his life, when he was younger, his father was a devout evangelical Christian. Just sexuality was just so like on the edge of life for him, and I think he was part of the Boy Scouts when he was younger, and he would get erections and he would get the urge to masturbate, and he was like literally told to pray it away. Like, Jesus will take those urges away from you. That's the devil. And so throughout his entire life, he struggled with this, and this is something he would face. And when he was a professor in college, he would get these students coming up to him, asking him these questions. And he just had more and more and more students, and he was really kind of lambasted across the entire country for these stances he took on sexuality, because both he and his wife were so... even probably for some people for today's standards, they were so open with sexuality and gender, and especially, the older generation of the country, they just weren't prepared for that. But younger generations were just eating it up because they, felt ridiculed for these sexualities and these, things that they were feeling that up until that point they were told were wrong. They were told that they shouldn't be feeling that if they were feeling that, they were sick.
Which is incredibly traumatizing. If you grow up being told that, I grew up in a very strict religion / cult, and my entire life I was taught that, it's bad for women to enjoy sex or things like that. If you're taught that your whole life, then when you finally do start participating in that, or when you find that with your partner, it can literally create issues with you and your partner. You can't enjoy that intimacy because you were told it's bad. So we told an entire community of queer people that their views and on sexuality and who they choose to love and how they choose to do that was wrong. So even if they're with their partners and things like that, it invades the home, it invades your mind, and it's very intrusive into someone's life when you tell them that.
And it was around this time, and in the 1940s, into the 1950s, obviously we're coming out of World War II, but at the time, there were a lot of younger people moving into cities. And a part of that was just coming back from the war, wanting change. They wanted to go and, look for opportunity, especially because during World War II, they had to make all these big factories in these urban areas, and that was where work was. So you get these soldiers returning, and, with city life came vibrance, came, bars, dance clubs, all this stuff. And with that, it brought on a visibility for the gay community. Ultimately, scrutiny and opinions, yes. But ultimately, this led to kind of the onslaught of protests and run-ins with the law that the queer community had, in which ultimately we're leading it to now is the queer revolution of 1969.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to we have a couple more things just to cover before we get to Stonewall, but we are getting to Stonewall. And I know like a lot of people, they pretty much think that it started in 1969, but as you can already see, like, there are all these elements that led up to it. And, and starting in after World War II, there was a whole new idea of like, like freedom, of suburbia, of what that you had to have, what's it called, like 2.5 kids and all this stuff,
Right.
and so there was a huge shift basically with the beginning of baby boomers being born, of a lot of changes and a lot of ideas about what a family should be and what it shouldn't be. And at the same time, you had a lot of gay people that were, that took part in World War II, that were secretly in the military, that were just as proud as anyone else to be American. And when they got home, they couldn't be who they wanted to be. So for example, and yet they tried though. And for example, one of the earliest examples of gay people basically being proud of who they were and sort of like congregating without much shame, was in New Orleans starting in 1959. There was a thing called the Gay Carnival, which actually still goes today and actually is still celebrated today, where these were these elaborate balls that the queer community would throw. And what was great about it was they actually figured out that they could hide amongst Mardi Gras, and because Mardi Gras had this rule that would change the law just for like the day or the weekend, that said that you could dress in unusual clothing and that you could wear masks and you could wear makeup and all these different things, and there were all these things that a lot of people in the queer community wanted to try. And so on this day, it was sort of like queer Halloween, I guess, where like you could basically blend in and everybody was kind of like more accepting, a little bit more strange, a little more queer.
That's like one of my new favorite fun facts of like Stick It to the Man of like, okay, well, we're gonna do your parade, but we're loving it the whole time. Like, right. I love that so much. I'm so happy I know this now.
and so that went pretty well for a couple of years, and then in 1962. The crew of Yuga's ball was raided by police. 98 people were arrested for disturbing the peace, probably because they were also queer, and that's probably what really was being called out on.
Mm-hmm.
But
not necessarily loud and rambunctious,
Right. And basically it kind of broke up the public viewing of these balls for many years, but these things were still being done in private at people's private houses from then on. It became a yearly tradition. There's a great story about, I guess, one of the bar owners named Miss Dixie heard that all these people had been arrested for 98 people had been arrested, and she actually took all the money out of her till and went out and bailed them all out. Is how the story goes. And saying something like that she couldn't have her boys like in jail or whatever. And like I just thought that image of somebody like opening one of those big cash registers and just pulling the money out and like taking it down to the jail to
save my people.
Get everyone out. Yeah, like that was just like so cool or whatever. So anyway, it was one of the first examples of it happening. In San Francisco, police raided a place in 1965 on New Year's Day. Costume ball that had been formed by the newly formed Council on Religion and the Homosexual. Officers sought to photograph all the attendees, and they ended up making 2 arrests. But the crazy thing was, they photographed them in order to like put them sort of like in a like a list or whatever. They're always trying to make people into the lists.
Mm-hmm. It's a good way to divide them.
Yeah, and it was and there was a great quote in this article talking about it where they said, we get that these bars were like kind of crappy places. They were seedy, they were kind of like where you really wouldn't want to be unless you had to be. But what they said was that even though they were like this, they ended up being like our homes because they were a lot of them were thrown out of their homes. And so sometimes these bars were even more of a place that felt like their home than their actual home. And they said, quote, for police to invade these spaces really fought against the notion of any kind of self-determination and safety for us. I mean, essentially it pissed them off. It was sort of like their last refuge, and it was constantly being raided and attacked by that day's police. 1959, a group of transgender women, lesbians, and gay men fought back against police harassment in what turned into a melee outside Cooper Donuts in downtown Los Angeles. This was believed to be the first uprising against police harassment. So this is actually the first time they fought back. So you're kind of starting to, see the government kind of bubble, fighting back against the government starting to kind of bubble.
And I just want to say,
go ahead.
And you touched on it earlier, but the reason we're diving into this stuff that really not many people recognize when it comes to gay rights, because there's so many people that reference, the first brick that was thrown at Stonewall, and that's the start of, the fight for gay rights in America. But far before that, there were people that were fighting. There were people that were taking stances, starting groups, and, it started, with even small things, even just small acts of defiance, where they were having these parties and they were having these parades, against the, the will of the government. And so I'm just saying this again to reiterate that Stonewall was not the beginning. Stonewall was, was kind of a landmark. It was a catalyst. But the fuse was lit far before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nothing comes from nothing. There's always stuff that led up to whatever you've read about. If you've had the privilege of reading about it, which most people haven't, and I think even a lot of like gay people or queer people, don't really know how far back a lot of these things went.
It's interesting. Too, because with we're talking about these extravagant parties and these New Orleans parades and all this, and it even started in the Roaring 20s, the 1920s, for example, and to show that it spanned across the country. We're talking about San Francisco, Louisiana, and it even spans races.
Basically, they were being picked on too. They were being really singled out by police and by governments and all that too. It wasn't necessarily
they're being hunted down.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't being left alone. So it kind of goes to say that that had they been a little smarter, they would have just kind of let them be, and it probably would have taken much longer for any kind of revolution to happen. But because they kept pushing and kept invading and kept hunting people down, making it impossible for them to live the way that they wanted to live, then it started boiling over.
Well, and I really quickly want to say too, I have some straight people in my life I know that like to talk a lot about, well, why does there have to be quote unquote safe spaces for, queer people, or why are there queer clubs? Like, shouldn't there be straight clubs? I'm like, everything's a straight club. Like we just listed off exactly why. So it's easy to make jokes about safe spaces or, well, then we're going to have a straight club or whatever. But straight people made it so that nowhere was a safe place for these people. So this is why we're explaining right now why it was extremely important for these individuals to be able to have a community and feel safe, because we didn't let them feel safe.
Right. And I hope that, gay bars and gay organizations stay around for all of time. There's a lot of evidence that actually they're being less frequent and less used now. But it's actually a good thing, because it's actually a sign that gay people are feeling more a part of general society, and they're being accepted in a wider variety of bars and stuff. But the other reason that a lot of people, even in modern, more accepting times, go to gay bars is because they want to meet people who they might date, they might have sex with, just like straight people do. But if you imagine as a straight person walking into a bar and 10% of the people that you're even attracted to even have the possibility of being into your sex. You wouldn't go to that bar because you wouldn't have any chance of really striking up a meaningful relationship. So it kind of cut through some of that stuff. It was also protective. It was
dangerous. If a gay person, if a gay man goes up to a straight man and hits on him, and that guy doesn't take it very well, that could end very violently. So this was quite literally, yes, a safe space to go and enjoy yourself and date people.
You look at, modern times, once again, to translate it to something that we deal with today, dating apps. You've got, apps like Grindr that's specifically made for the gay community, which I don't know how popular Grindr is. That's just like the first one I could think of.
It's really popular.
I don't know if this is if I'm making this up in my head, but someone told me, I guess I could Google it, that there's an app for a lesbian woman called Blunder. So it's Blunder and Grindr. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I kind of like
We've got farmersonly.com,
right.
Christian
right.
Mingle.
Now we're getting very specific.
But
The crazy thing about Grindr though is especially like when I first started dating guys and stuff and coming out and all that, like Grindr was actually really important. And as sleazy as Grindr is, and like I don't exactly recommend it, especially not now, but as sleazy as it is, like it also was really helpful because it not only is a dating app, but it also says like these are the amount of people that are around you within like a 2-mile radius or something like that.
Right.
So if you're in like any kind of populated area, you quickly realize that like if you felt alone, you're really not alone because literally next door is somebody else, and so like it actually it served a great purpose, and it also, which I think is what maybe you mentioned it right now after we're talking about the bars being less frequent, and what it actually did was it made it so that you didn't have to necessarily go to a seedy bar to meet somebody, like-minded or whatever, as far as your sexuality. Like it meant that you could be anywhere and you could find out, that there was somebody that was like you, that you could talk to, that you could go on a date with or whatever, that was really close. And that was really important to me when I first started questioning all that stuff.
When you look at even, like how, people in the queer community feel like, it wasn't safe to go out and they had to, go to these seedy places and, kind of had to stay in the darkness. And you look at, for example, a movie like Philadelphia, how because Tom Hanks's character had to, go to these seedy places to, quite frankly, enjoy sexuality and be with a partner, he ended up contracting HIV. And so, throughout all of this, it's just this dangerous thing that people of the queer community had to deal with, but it's places like these bars and places like these parades and these house parties that they could go and feel safe and, have a place to express themselves amongst their peers.
When you cast somebody in the shadows and you make it something that is like that you judge as being wrong or whatever, like you're automatically making it worse. Like, if you stigmatize something and you make them do it in secret, something that for which feels natural that they're going to do no matter what you do, you make it so much worse. Like I would think that like if you were a parent of somebody who was gay, or let's just say queer, a parent of somebody who was queer, you would feel so much better now that your child could, instead of having to go to a seedy bar to meet somebody that they could fall in love with, that, they might just talk to somebody on campus, or they might just be at a coffee shop or something. And they would see that somebody was right next to them that could relate to them or whatever. Like they didn't, it's like, that would be such a comfort, I would think to any parent. And, so if you're out there and you're dealing with that, you should really look at these things as technology or whatever as like a real help, and not be like, oh, you're gay, well, I'm definitely gonna take your phone away or whatever. Like, you're making it so much worse because, it's like you're basically telling them, you have to hide this from me. You have to, do this in possibly a place that's not safe. And that's not what most parents want, even if you're not all for the whole them being queer thing.
And I think it's important to remember too, if your religious beliefs or whatever, you don't agree with the queer community and their lifestyle or who they choose to love, and you want to kind of talk about this, well, just don't shove it down my throat. That just remember that doesn't work both ways. By saying just don't let me see it, don't let me know about it, that completely makes someone unable to talk about it, to show who they are. So that does not work both ways. Unfortunately, in order for someone else and for you to have your beliefs, someone else also gets to have their beliefs. So let's try to remember that when we try to, tell someone, well, I just don't want to see it.
There was a phrase that really made a huge difference to me when I was trying to come out, or I was considering whether I wanted to go that route, because at the time I kind of liked both men and women. And so the phrase I heard, I don't remember what I heard it in, but it was this idea of guilty by omission. And it was this idea that, even if you don't exactly lie about it, that by completely omitting it from your life, you are guilty of lying, to yourself or to other people just by simply not saying anything. And that really made a huge difference to me. Because, for a while I was like, well, maybe I'll just like try to figure this out, or, maybe I won't tell anybody, and all this stuff. And eventually I was like, wait, like, why am I feeling guilty? And it was because of that. It was because, by not saying it, it still was a lie. And so by not talking to somebody who is gay, like you're essentially doing that to them.
I just watched this movie called Come Sunday, and it was okay. But it's basically just taking a hard look at the literal readings of the Bible, and it's following this priest or pastor. I don't know Christianity, and he's just struggling with what he's been preaching for the past 20 years. But there's kind of like this side story about the person who plays piano in his choir, and it turns out that he's gay. And, he's struggling with it because he's sinning. He knows, God's going to send him to hell for being gay. And the priest, comforts him by saying being gay and doing gay are not the same thing. And so as long as you avoid doing gay, then there's a chance that you can get into heaven or whatever. It was a very interesting stance that, like, I had never
that's
really
the Mormon
heard
Church's
of.
official stance.
Is it
by the
really?
way. You may have gay thoughts. Well, you shouldn't, but apparently you can, as long as you don't act on them. And they encourage you to marry a man or a woman, regardless of whether you're attracted to them. That's the official stance. And I just want to say, in my personal opinion, God wants you to be happy. If that's if you're someone that is in religion and you are religious and you believe in a higher power, just take a step back. And I don't think that they want you to be miserable, so don't. That's not fair to tell someone that they can't be happy at all, in my opinion.
It's interesting too because it's especially in the 60s and I guess previous time, it seemed like especially local and state governments really tried to kind of protect their white suburban communities. Of course they did,
Dalen. Yeah. They were the voters.
From even just seeing or witnessing, this this terrible, queer community and the acts that they're partaking in, which Curtis, I'm hoping you can dive into more, was especially took place in Compton's Cafeteria riot in 1966.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole idea of suburban life was to get away from cities too. So it was sort of like it was like a roundabout way of saying get away from people of different colors, religions, sexuality, so. Because
especially when urban life became synonymous with, black.
Evil.
Right.
Or the city's evil.
Or just different. I just say just different. You can kind of just pick one at random, and it was something you were trying to avoid if you were moving to suburbia in a lot of cases. In 1966, Compton's Cafeteria had a riot, and what's really interesting about this one is it's one of the first riots led by transgender women, drag queens, and to a lesser degree, lesbians and gays as well, and bisexuals as well. Because but it was really led by them.
At the time, there was still, even within the queer community, there was this still kind of a division between trans people and, gay and lesbian people, right?
Yeah, it was even to this day. There's disagreements. It's sort of like these people are related in the way that they're being unfairly persecuted or treated differently or whatever, and then it's kind of sort of related in that it's like sexuality and gender, but really you're talking about a whole spectrum of people that sort of just banded together out of the need for it. And at least up to this time, there was still a huge division on what they thought they should do, what they whether or not they wanted to all do it together or to do it separately. And so what they did was they destroyed this cafeteria. A lot of these people had been forced, trans people and drag queens had been forced into sex work because they couldn't get any other work. Thank you, government. It's look what you created. It's they wanted to be a banker or whatever, and now the only thing they can do is sex work. So now they're doing these
and guess what was and still is severely looked down upon? sex work.
Exactly.
Ding, ding, ding.
Exactly. So it made them even more, disliked by communities, and it made, so I mean it.
And it gave them
made them
a
much worse.
stigma of, oh, well, you're a sex worker, you're this dirty, you're, this slum, like.
Oh, don't worry. You could be a banker, but you just had to completely hide who you were and be miserable with your identity. That's all you had to do, guys.
Yeah.
Come on now.
That's it. And so they were tired of being arrested, and for cross-dressing, for just being who they were, in some cases for being sex workers. And so the quote "screaming queens" erupted one night after one of their own was being hauled away from the cafeteria. And so apparently after she was being taken, or while she's being taken away, she emptied a steaming cup of coffee in the police officer's face, and all hell broke loose. Now,
I love that.
Now this goes really, like, I was having a conversation with somebody today about the Black Lives Matter thing, and I always have to start off by saying that I don't condone violence. I don't condone hurting police. These are people too. Having said that, at the same time, at some point, you push a community so far into the corner that things like this are going to happen because you've taken away every other refuge, every other, a law protecting them or their rights or their dignity. If you push somebody far enough, they're going to do things like this. And you're lucky if you only get a hot steaming cup of coffee thrown in your face.
Well, and you can't just support that kind of anarchy when it's dumping tea into the Boston Harbor.
Right.
These have been happening throughout the history of time, and we have them in our history as revolution, and it's whatever. And I hope in the future we call a lot of this revolution too, because that's what it's been in the past. So you can't just kind of pick and choose which violence or aggression serves a higher purpose and serves progress, because
and when it's done for a righteous reason, you look back on it and it you look back on it positively, so
Absolutely.
It's not to say that you should just burn something down because you're mad or whatever, but at the same time, like if it was done because of injustice, I think there's a huge gray area there that if you're Black, you would or even if you're not, would agree happened with the civil rights era. If you're a patriot, you would agree happened with the revolution.
If you're a patriot.
Well, I think if you're listening to these examples of violence against police officers from the queer community or with Black Lives Matter stuff, and you're angry about it, I think having some empathy from the perspective of remembering and of where we came from because of revolution. So just try to remember that when you're getting frustrated with these individuals, of this has happened through the history of time and we've supported it, or we wouldn't have America be America right now. So
absolutely. And the other important thing about this riot is, unlike Stonewall, that is covered a lot lately, one of the reasons you haven't probably heard of this,
which is what I alluded to, is it wasn't covered. To the press and the public, LGBT people were so odious then, this is a quote, that in the 60s, quote, peace and love era, San Francisco, ironically, that even something as newsworthy as their street battle with police needed to be kept from innocent eyes. So,
wow.
Think about all the things throughout history that you've been, blinded to because it wasn't convenient for whatever, narrative that they were trying to spin. And, and I find that in a lot of cases, when something feels like there's a hole in when you're listening to history, like you feel like there's a hole in the story, it's usually because somebody's omitting something. And usually it's because somebody's doing it on purpose to kind of, glaze over something that is inconvenient.
100%.
And so then there was also the Black Cat Bar in Silver Lake that was raided just after midnight on New Year's Day, which, what's up with New Year's Day and like raids? Like, I mean, gosh, don't they want the day off? Like,
the top of the year.
Yeah.
We're going to start it
New
off
year,
strong.
new raid. Let's go, boys.
The New Year resolution every year, like, I mean, gosh, 1967, police beat patrons and arrested more than a dozen people. Several weeks later, hundreds peacefully gathered outside the bar in a protest, and it was a seminal turning point in the early gay rights movement. I think Silver Lake is in LA, but I'm not actually sure about that.
It's very interesting, going over these different incidences that happen, kind of progressing through the 60s, how, we look at them and more and more, it's starting to look like a movement. You see this momentum build, and you see this kind of collective ideology, and it's just building more and more. And As you can see, it builds and the fuse gets shorter and shorter and shorter as it comes closer to the catalyst of Stonewall. And that, folks, is where we will pick it up in the next episode as we take on Stonewall and the aftermath that follows. Curtis, Kara, do y'all have any plugs for today's episode?
Yeah, I've been wanting to plug the NOLA drag tours. It's a tour that I took in New Orleans that was really interesting, and even though we didn't get any information for this episode from that tour, it definitely got me interested in all queer history and the history of women and sex workers in New Orleans. And it's a lot of stuff that's not in the history book. So I highly recommend, if you're in New Orleans, check out NOLA drag tours. And if you're not in New Orleans, check them out online. They even have a podcast where they'll tell you the other side of history that just doesn't get reported.
Yeah, I think don't stop here. With our podcast, this is just a snippet of what there is to learn and to talk about. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves. So if you find anything interesting, keep on digging, or let us know if you want us to expand on it.
Curtis, going off of that, can you tell the listeners what we've got coming ahead? We've got a big series in front of us.
Yeah, I think when we started this off, we originally said it was going to be 3 episodes, and that was kind of naive of us all, I think, because after we started digging into the topic of queer history and the trans movements, we realized it's a huge topic that actually needed a full treatment, and often kind of gets sort of cut down to just the Stonewall, and that was basically it, and then nothing has happened before or since. So the next 2 episodes are going to be on Stonewall, which is coming up next, and then the episode after that is going to be everything that happened after Stonewall and the modern pride movement. After we're done with that, we're going to switch to another 3-part series that's going to be on the trans experience and on what gender means to the trans community.
Awesome. So stick around. Let us know if there's anything that you want us to cover specifically moving forward. But with that, we'll talk to y'all in the next episode when we cover Stonewall. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to Social Discord, part of the Podcast Without Borders Network. You can get a hold of us by sending us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. Thanks for listening.